I'm going to show you how to paint a simple landscape, and I'm going to talk about using photographs, the do's and don'ts, and how to compose a composition for a watercolour painting. So let's get started. So the first thing I did, as you can see, is I cropped out the aeroplane. You can still use that foreground and extend it, but I didn't want that as a distraction, so I will make the foreground a little bit bigger. So you could stay with this composition, but I'm going to go one further. I'm going to crop it a little bit more to make it more rectangular rather than this panoramic view. So this is the scene that I've decided upon, so I've cropped it a little bit on the left and on the right, and I will extend that foreground as well. So before I've even started painting, I'm already constructing the composition, and you can start making pencil sketches as well from this. So my two top tips for using photographs for watercolour paintings is don't include everything, crop, make it your own, but also don't copy photographs, interpret them, use them as a source of inspiration. Otherwise, they tend to look a little bit flat. So I hope you find those two top tips helpful. So let's start talking about the drawing and composing this painting from the photograph. Well, first of all, the sky is amazing, and I'm pretty much going to use that sky or be inspired by it. So I've decided to go just below halfway to start sketching in here. I'm using an HB pencil. I'm painting on 300 grams watercolour paper on a cold pressed surface, so it's got a bit of texture. And I'm just sketching in the distant mountains. So I'm not going for tiny detail at the moment. I'm actually sort of separating the large areas. Sometimes if you draw a line that's halfway in your painting, it separates the top half from the bottom half. It can look a bit flat. So it's quite nice to have maybe a big sky. I've also used washi tape around the border of my watercolour paper, and that will give me a nice white border at the end. It's quite a nice way of presenting your work, but also detaching yourself from your work to make decisions on whether you need to make any more changes. So I hope you found that helpful. So I'm sketching in these trees on the right hand side, and they've got a little bit of perspective. So the tree nearest to us is larger, and it kind of steps down as it goes into the distance. The trees get smaller, and that creates depth in the painting. So the little sort of trees and bushes in the distance will be tiny compared to the trees and bushes in the foreground, and you just gradually reduce the size as it goes further away, and I'll talk more about that later when I'm painting the watercolour. So this is kind of a rough sketch. It's really for scale and placement of the trees and bushes here. So as you can see, I'm just sort of sketching in sort of diagonal lines as well to lead your eye into the distance, again to create depth in your painting. I'm just sketching in the very smaller trees here and dividing up the fields. So yes, I'm using some of the elements from the photograph, but I'm also kind of going my own way so you don't slavishly copy the photograph. I quite like working a little bit from my imagination and a photographic source as well. A top tip for you would be take your own photographs of a scene and then make some sketches, hopefully at the scene, so you've almost lived it, and keep those in your sketchbook, so when you start to paint the picture you can refer to your sketches and to your photograph as well. So let's get on with the painting. I'm using my size 10 round brush. I'm using Cobalt blue, and it's kind of a milky wash, and always make sure you mix plenty of paint before you start painting. This is some Cerulean, and I'm adding more water to it because it's going to be for the distant sky. And what I'm doing now is I'm mixing up some cobalt blue with a touch of cadmium red to make some cloud shadow colour. And that's going to be a milky wash as well, so slightly thicker than the watery wash to create some stronger shadow colours. So I'm using my large flat 1-inch brush now, and I'm wetting the paper. So always do this after you mix your colours. Otherwise, if you do this first, it's dried by the time you finish mixing your colours. So I'm starting off with my size 10 brush and with the cobalt blue, painting wet into wet. And I'm pretty much sort of looking at that photograph and trying to kind of get the look of that sky. It doesn't have to be the same, but just similar. And it's guiding me. So I've just touched a little bit more cobalt blue there just to make it slightly stronger. So the colours at the top of your painting here should be stronger in tonal value, and they get lighter as they go towards the horizon because that's miles away, so it looks paler. And that's what I'm trying to achieve here. Also, the clouds are bigger, so those shapes at the top are much bigger, and as I paint the marks or shapes in the distance using negative painting, so I'm actually painting the blue sky around the clouds, they get smaller. So I'm using the Cerulean to paint that distant sky because that's that paler colour. This is the cloud shadow colour, so it's the red with the cobalt blue, and I'm painting this damp into damp. So the paper isn't as wet now, so it's not running as much, and I don't want this cloud shadow colour to run too much because I still want the white at the top of the clouds there. So this makes the clouds look really fluffy with the shadows underneath. And as I go into the distance, I'm using the tip of my brush more than the whole of the brush to paint the smaller clouds. And I'm just painting a little bit more cloud shadow at the top there, touch to the right, tickling that paint through. And I'm just going to dilute my brush, take the excess water off, and just sort of pale that distant sky there, blending it over the top of the distant fields there, really making everything almost disappear. It really does create depth, this. And I'm just lifting off some of the paint there just to make sure I've got some lovely light at the top of those clouds as well. So I'm mixing up here a little bit of phthalo blue, very watery, and I'm adding a tiny little bit of the cadmium red there. So it's a very sort of grey colour, and I'm just layering this very thin wash over the distant fields there, distant hills. And what I'm doing now is I'm rinsing my brush. I'm going to get a tiny speck of yellow into that blue, so it's about 80% blue, 20% yellow, painting this blue-green sort of very transparent wash over that sort of grey sky there, wet into wet. Adding a touch more yellow now with a little bit more of the blue, so slightly creamier colour. Not too creamy, still quite watery, and dropping this in wet into wet, so it's still kind of a blue-green wash, and the blue will create distance. Blue colours recede, warmer colours come forward. So I'm starting off now with ultramarine with a little bit of quinacridone gold, about 70% ultramarine, so still kind of a blue-green wash. Ultramarine's slightly a warmer colour, and I'll put a link in the description below all about using and mixing warm and cool colours. But it's good to know in landscape painting which ones will help your painting to create depth. So ultramarine has a little bit more red in it, so it kind of comes forward. And as you saw there, I've added some more yellow being sort of more of a warmer colour, and it will start to bring the fields now in the middle ground here forward. And what I'm doing now is adding more yellow, a touch of burnt sienna, more ultramarine, so it's a really sort of strong, bold, warm green. That burnt sienna is a lovely sort of warm mid-brown. And I'm painting using my size 12 brush, nice big brush, the foreground. I even added a touch more burnt sienna there, so it's a really rich, warm green. So it's a blue mixed with two warm colours, the yellow and the brown. Because what we're doing is we're working on a 2D surface to create a 3D illusion. So I'm mixing up a little bit more of the phthalo blue with a touch of cadmium yellow, slightly creamier. Taken the excess off, as you saw on my paper towel. I'm painting damp into wet here, just using the tip of my brush to paint these smaller, paler trees in the distance. I'm painting with my size 4 round brush. This is a little bit more of the phthalo blue, even slightly thicker with a pinch of that yellow. Taking the excess off again and painting a little bit more damp into wet here, just some darker marks. So you've got some paler sort of smaller trees and then slightly darker in this cool blue green, and just sort of, you know, kind of using my imagination really here and just painting some of these small bushes and trees. This is some ultramarine, and I've used a little bit of that blue green there, and I'm just sort of adding this as well, damp into damp pretty much here, just darkening up some of those trees here and there. Watercolour does dry paler, so you almost have to compensate for that. So I'm just painting some really, really small marks just on top of the hill here, and it's pretty much damp into wet. They're a little bit paler, and I've watered down the colour a bit more so they don't come forward as much. So they really look like they're way off in the distance. The marks are smaller and the tonal value is a lot paler, and of course the colour is cooler and those cool colours recede. So I've added a little bit more yellow to the phthalo blue here. So it's actually looking a little bit more green, and it's slightly thicker because I want it slightly darker. Taking the excess paint off here, and I'm going to paint that sort of next sort of row of trees and bushes with my size 4 brush, this time more damp into damp because the paper is drying off a little bit. And I'm varying the sizes here as well, making some larger and some smaller, just dropping in a slightly darker blue-green there. I'm mixing up a creamier colour here. This is Ultramarine and Quinacridone Gold. Taking the excess paint off on the paper towel and painting damp into damp. It's almost dry, the paper actually, so I've got a nice sort of dry brush effect as well. So there's some texture, and what texture does, it brings those trees forward and again creates that illusion of depth, which is fabulous. But that sort of warmer green also comes forward as well. And again, I'm using the tip of my brush and varying the shapes and sizes there, and also leaving gaps here and there, using that sort of blue-green, darker, creamier wash and just painting it at the bottom of those trees to create some shadows. So this is very creamy, dark paint here. Taking the excess off, that's the phthalo blue with a touch of yellow, and just sort of painting these very dark colours. You can see it's a lot darker than those trees in the distance, and the dark of those trees comes forward away from those distant trees. So I'm just adding a few more darks, damp into damp with my size 4 brush. So I'm pretty much working on the trees nearest to me. So I want to mix up a variety of greens. This one's the phthalo blue with the quinacridone gold, really creamy. And this is a little bit more of the phthalo blue, very, very dark here. And I'm just going to add some ultramarine to this one here, and a touch of yellow on its own here, just with that bit of blue on my brush. So you pretty much got a yellow green, and I'm painting this very sort of pale colour. It's pretty dry at the moment now on this paper, and you could call it wet on dry. If you're not sure, just allow your painting to dry. And I'm using a dry side brush technique here. So scrubbing the painting on with the belly of the brush creates lots of yummy textures, and textures come forward. Textures create details. So I've just added some quinacridone gold to that colour as well. Into damp, still using my size 4 brush with that luscious dark green. So that's more blue and less yellow, and giving a little bit of the side brush, dry brush there to create some textures, varying the sort of height and the gaps between them. Here on the trees on the right, as you can see, again, I'm using the belly of the brush to apply the paint to create texture, plus the paint doesn't run as much for that dark shadow colour. And just sort of painting a little bit of dark now, just underneath those trees to sort of show the sort of separation of the fields, etc. And as you can see, this sort of detail and making them slightly larger than the distant trees really does create depth in the painting as well. So I'm rinsing my brush here, taking the excess water off and just softening and blending here and there, and diluting as well to create some lighter bushes here and there. And that works really well, especially in the foreground, because you get the sort of contrast of lights and darks as well. I'm just softening these trees on the right with a clean damp brush. And now I'm going to use a plastic card, and I'm going to just sort of scratch into the sort of foreground trees and bushes here. And what that does, it creates a permanent scratch on the surface of your paper. The paint runs in and it creates some really nice dark thin lines, but also you can lift off to create lighter areas as well, lighter, thinner lines. I'm mixing up some burnt sienna and ultramarine, about 50-50 to make a dark brown. I'm taking the excess paint off and I'm going to paint the tree trunks. The one nearest is going to be the longest one, and they gradually get smaller as they go away. Again, this creates depth in your painting. I'm painting pretty much wet on dry with my size 4 brush, and you may want to make the tree furthest away a little bit paler as well. And now I'm mixing up some ultramarine with some cadmium red, to make a sort of a grey blue, taking the excess off again, and just paint some cast shadows, this cool cast shadow here, and just making them smaller as they go away, and again make them a little bit paler again to create depth. So just by learning these few rules can really help, especially if you're a beginner in watercolour painting, or just, you've been painting for a while. These helpful things can really assist you, especially landscape painting. So I'm mixing up some quinacridone gold, creamy wash, using the belly of my brush and sort of scrubbing on the paint, adding a little bit of dark green there as well to create some bushes. But again, this texture and size will create depth in your painting. Rinsing my brush there. I'm just going to soften the shadow colours, making this one here a touch wider and pushing it back into the grasses to make them look more natural. Remember, when you're doing stuff like this, keep rinsing the brush, taking the excess water off, make sure your brush is clean. I'm going to paint a few grasses in the foreground, just using that sort of mid to dark green there, using my size 4 brush, painting pretty much wet on dry. Some of the grasses here right in the foreground, varying the heights. I'm just adding a touch of the green to those shadows as well. And I'm lifting off with my plastic card to create some details and texture here in between these sort of bushes and trees. And I'm just painting a few darks here using ultramarine with a touch of the burnt sienna on the right hand side. And I've just rinsed my brush. I'm just softening that dark here. So there's some really strong darks right in the foreground there, and I'm painting a few more darker grasses. Rinsing my brush, I just want to make a little puddle and I'm spattering some paint. This will create detail and texture. And do remember to mask out your sky. I didn't. You may get some paint spots there otherwise. I'm mixing up some of the cadmium yellow here. I'm just going to spatter some of that yellow on the sort of left-hand side of the tree to create some lighter textures, a little bit on the grasses as well. I did remember to sort of mask out the sky with my hand. And I'm going to finish off now with this mid-green here with some side brush, dry brush on the dry paper with my size 10 brush to represent some cloud shadows there on the ground. And here is the finished painting. I've removed the washi tape. Just going to give you a close up there. And I'm really pleased with it. It does look more 3D. Those trees do look far away. So I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and you found it helpful, especially in landscape painting. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section. And if you'd like to see more content like this, don't forget to subscribe to my channel where you will get updates of my latest tutorials. And if you'd like to support my channel and get access to exclusive weekly tutorials, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? Details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Happy painting. Bye for now.